So I'm going to read some of Howard Zinn's A People's History of the United States in order to determine our relationship with Guatemala. And the 1954 coup d'etat did do a lot of damage. And there's also the Bill Clinton. I always get those guys confused. So I'm just going to read it, okay? So page 439 in Guatemala. That's actually 438 on the bottom. In Iran, in 1953, the CIA Central Intelligence Agency succeeded in overthrowing a government which nationalized the oil industry. In Guatemala, in 1954, a legally elected government was overthrown by an invasion force of mercenaries trained by the CIA at military bases in Honduras and Nicaragua and supported by 4 American fighter planes flown by American pilots. The invasion put into power Colonel Carlos Castillo Armas, who had at one time received military training at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas. The government that the United States overthrew was the most democratic Guatemala had ever had. The president, Jacobo Arbenz, was a left-of-center socialist. 4 of the 56 seats in the Congress were held by communists. 4 of the 56 seats. What was most unsettling to American business interests was that Arbenz had expropriated 234,000 acres of land owned by United Fruit, offering compensation that United Fruit called unacceptable. Armas in power gave the land back to United Fruit, abolished the tax on interest and dividends to foreign investors, eliminated the secret ballot, and jailed thousands of political critics. Thousands. Secret ballot eliminated, so pretty much killed democracy. And then in 1958, the Eisenhower government sent thousands of Marines to Lebanon to make sure the pro-American government there was not toppled by a revolution and to keep an armed presence in that oil-rich area. So the Democrat, Republican, Liberal, Conservative agreement to prevent or overthrow revolutionary governments whenever possible, whether communist, socialist, or anti-United Fruit, became most evident in 1961 in Cuba. Okay, so they're essentially just in 1953, we're overthrowing Iran because they nationalized the oil industry. 1954, we overthrew Guatemala because of the land reform. And then we're going to go after Cuba because they're socialist, and then Lebanon because there was a revolution that was happening in Lebanon in 1958. So Eisenhower did it twice, in 1954 and 1958. 53, I guess he did 3 times, right? So he was elected president in 1952, so 53 is after 52. So Eisenhower overthrew Iran's government, Guatemala's government, and what was the other, Lebanon's government, or made sure that Lebanon kept their government, their dictatorship, their pro-right-wing authoritarian dictatorship, and smashed the possible revolution that was happening in Lebanon. So, yeah. So we intervened in Iran and Guatemala, and that's Eisenhower, Mr. 90% tax on corporate, 90% corporate tax. So that's the big, I guess, difference. What I had reported was just a bunch of different web pages on the internet, and combined with what I knew about it, I didn't realize that they were mostly mercenaries. So there were 4 American pilots, and there might have been some more. The CIA is the one who's organizing and arranging all this. So there was 490 guys who goes in it, but apparently those 490 are mercenaries. So I don't even know who those 500 people are. Are they local Hondurans, Nicaraguans? Who are they? CIA paid 500, I guess, terrorists, right? They paid 500 secret terrorists. And in some respects, you know, terrorism, it's a hypocritical policy to finance terrorism while pretending to fight against it. As a tactic, though, I mean, I don't know, because you only put 4 American pilots' lives in danger. So I guess what I was saying is that if it works, it's a great idea, but if it doesn't work, then what the fuck are you doing? So this was a good coup d'etat. This was a bad coup d'etat, but it was successful. And so the way that they implemented, so the CIA, the American government, had a naval blockade of Guatemala, so nobody could go in and out. So they isolated Guatemala, said, you know, a bunch of bad things about them, essentially was shaming them across the world. So when we do invade, well, why did you invade? All because of all the shit we were saying about them just a month ago. So they had this propaganda campaign. They had a naval blockade. 4 American pilots was flying 4 American planes. There was bombing of Guatemala City. So we bombed their cities. And even though it's the CIA and they paid mostly mercenaries, which I don't even know where the mercenaries were from, but most of it, I guess, wasn't Americans, right? So they're mercenaries from where the fuck ever. They were the ones who had risked their lives, and they succeeded. So even though it was them that was putting their lives on the line, the possibility of the U.S. invading, like a Bay of Pigs thing, right? So Bay of Pigs failed. Well, hell, they just killed American troops. We need to invade the entire country. So that's what possibly could have set up, or perhaps Eisenhower could have backed off. But JFK actually did show some courage by backing out. You know, Bay of Pigs, we lost. So we lost that war. We lost that battle. Whatever the fuck Bay of Pigs was about, CIA trying to get us into a war, JFK, we lost a whole bunch of troops, but we didn't say, well, you know, for the troops, we need to start a war. So we backed out of it, right? So that's the difference between Honduras, Nicaragua. It's the difference between Cuba and Guatemala. So Guatemala was successful. So if Bay of Pigs had been successful, then we could have congratulated ourselves. But since it failed, well, you know, you fucked up. You done fucked up. So the mercenaries was the big difference that I noticed there. So there was some American lives and American blood, but very little. But the impending American, you know, invasion. So it was an American operation through and through. But just with a lot of deniability, plausible deniability. We had no idea what was going on in Chile. Kissinger would say some, you know, I guess in a way it makes sense, but he's not allowed to be happy about a certain outcome that had happened because he didn't want to be associated with him actually doing it. But he's sitting there saying, well, if that was the outcome that I wanted to happen anyways, why would I not show my happiness about it? Oh, yeah, right, you piece of shit, you fucking did it. That's why you're fucking happy about it. So, another passage about Guatemala, when it comes to the Iran-Contra scandal, the friendly dictatorship in Guatemala was used to get arms surreptitiously to the Contras. Israel, dependent on U.S. aid and always dependable for support, was also used. So Israel and Guatemala, they got some of the arms to the Contras. So how did the Contras in Nicaragua get their weapons? Well, they went through the dictatorship in Guatemala that was friendly for us. That was Ronald Reagan. He also solicited funds from Saudi Arabia, got $32 million from Saudi Arabia. And then basically the story goes away. Iran-Contra, I heard that there was a connection between Iran-Contra and JFK. Let's assume that they're totally separate. So the Iran-Contra affair become a perfect example of the double-line of defense of the American establishment. The first defense is to deny the truth. If exposed, the second defense is to investigate, but not too much. The press will publicize, but they will not get to the heart of the matter. Once the scandal was out in the open, neither the congressional investigating committees, nor the press, nor the trial court colonel Oliver North, who oversaw the Contra aid operation, got to the critical questions. What is U.S. foreign policy all about? How are the president and his staff permitted to support a terrorist group in Central America to overthrow a government that whatever its faults is welcomed by its own people is a great improvement over the terrible governments the U.S. has supported there for years? And what does the scandal tell us about democracy, about freedom of expression, about an open society? Out of the much-publicized Contragate scandal came no powerful critique of secrecy in government or the erosion of democracy by actions taken in secret by a small group of men, safe from the scrutiny of public opinion. The media in a country priding itself on its level of education and information kept the public informed only on the most superficial level. Okay, so the Guatemala, the military dictatorship, Reagan, he's also going to be there with Rios Montt, who's going to kill a whole bunch of Mayans, including the neighborhood, the village that Jacqueline was from. Her parents, her grandparents were from. So the last part where Guatemala is mentioned is late 1990s. He's talking about the immigration policies of Bill Clinton, so the late 90s, the second term of Bill Clinton, when he could have done the most progressive liberal shit that he wanted to do. So here's a Reuters dispatch from Mexico City, April 3rd, 1997, said about the tougher policy. Any crackdown against illegal immigration automatically angers Mexicans, millions of whom migrate legally and illegally across the 2,000-mile border to the United States in search of jobs each year. Hundreds of thousands of Central Americans who had fled death squads in Guatemala and El Salvador while the United States was giving military aid to those governments now face deportation because they had never been deemed political refugees. To admit that these cases were political would have given the lie to U.S. claims at the time that those repressive regimes were improving their human rights record and therefore deserved to continue receiving military aid. In early 1996, Congress and the President joined to pass an Anti-Terrorism and Effective Death Penalty Act, allowing deportation of any immigrant ever convicted of a crime, no matter how long ago or how serious. Lawful permanent residents who had married Americans and now had children were not exempt. The New York Times reported that July that hundreds of long-term legal residents have been arrested since the law passed. There is a certain irrationality to this new law, for it passed in response to the blowing up of the federal building in Oklahoma City by Timothy McVeigh, who was native-born. So, yeah, for those who fled Guatemala because of the United States, they were never given political refugee status, and so now they couldn't admit political refugee status because they would have to admit that the U.S. government was culpable in the 1954 coup d'etat, which is clear as mud, or clear as day that it happened. So that's the three passages on Guatemala by the People's History of the United States. Howard Zinn. R.I.P. Howard Zinn. R.I.P. Jacqueline. Peace.